Hi there. So in this video, one of my many videos for the Gmat verbal skills course, you should check out the others as well. We're going to talk about one of the biggest points of, let's say, the biggest points of confusion that a lot of people come up against when they're preparing for the Gmat. And that is the difference, the really substantial and really important difference between an assumption and an inference. And the reason I'm making this video is that so many people over the years have kind of come to me with this question: what is the difference between an assumption and an inference? That I thought it was worthwhile to make an entire video about this topic. Okay, so let's get started. And the way I'm going to do this is that we're going to begin by just kind of talking about sort of theoretically what assumptions are, what inferences are, some of the differences between them. And then afterward, we're going to go into more detail by doing specific questions, and by going through questions and going through examples. Okay, so let's just get started. Let's move down here and, oops. So let's talk about this word assumption. And specifically, let's talk about what it means on the Gmat exam. Now, you probably think back to the way you use the word assumption in your everyday life, and let's give ourselves an example. Like maybe, I don't know, this happened to me the other day where a friend of mine was asking me, you know, what type of music I'd like to listen to that evening, and he was kind of going through some of the possibilities, and he said, oh, hip-hop, well, you probably wouldn't want to listen to hip-hop. And then I said to him, well, no, you're making a huge assumption about me. Maybe that's something I like, right? That's what I said. You're making a huge assumption about me. And this is how we normally use the word assumption in everyday life, right? And what we really mean by that is that you're saying something for which you don't have a lot of evidence, right? This guy, he just kind of assumed, he just kind of said, well, you probably wouldn't like hip-hop, and so he moved on to something else, but he didn't really know, right? So in everyday life, right, and I'm actually going to write this, in the real world, what is an assumption? An assumption is a statement based on very little evidence. Right. That's the real world definition of an assumption. And probably the first difficulty with the Gmat is that real world definition of an assumption is not the definition that's used on the Gmat. So now let's go to the Gmat world. What is the Gmat world definition of an assumption? Well, this gets a little bit more tricky, right? In the Gmat world, and I'm going to write this out, and I'll explain it afterward, an assumption is a statement that A is not presented in the argument, but that B must be true for the argument to be valid. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack right there, so let's read it again. An assumption is a statement that A is not presented in the argument. Okay, so that means that if you read an argument and anything that is written on the page in that argument, and here I'm really talking about a Gmat style argument that you've certainly seen in critical reasoning questions. Anything that's written in that argument is by definition not an assumption. So an assumption is not written in the argument, it's not stated, it's something that maybe the author is thinking about, maybe not, but the author is not writing it down in the argument itself. And the second thing is it's a statement that must be true for the argument to be valid. Okay. And when I say for the argument to be valid, I really mean for the argument to be even possible in the first place, for the conclusion to be possible, right? All right, now this is a very kind of theoretical, pure logic-y definition for what an assumption is. And it's certainly important to know, it's certainly important to think about, it's certainly important to understand, but I don't feel that this is the most helpful way of looking about what an assumption is for the GMAT. And so I'm going to give you the final useful definition. This is the one that I like to use, especially when I'm practicing and especially when I'm working with my students. So the useful definition is the following. An assumption is the opposite of a weakness, right? And I mean opposite, by opposite I mean sort of the negative of a weakness. And this might not make sense to you either, it probably doesn't in fact, but we're going to see many examples of this afterward, right? And so when we're dealing with an assumption question, so let me write this, how to approach an assumption question. Well, number one, I recommend obviously that you carefully read, and this is true of any critical reasoning question, carefully read the argument, right, and identify the evidence and conclusion. Okay, that's the first step anytime you have a critical reasoning question, so that's not something new. Number two, obviously carefully read the question and consider the specific vocabulary used in the question. Once again, this is nothing new, this is nothing specific to assumption questions. This is where it changes a bit. Number three, what I recommend that you do is think of a few potential weaknesses in the argument, right? And so this is really kind of a departure from some of the other stuff we've talked about. Usually I really don't recommend trying to predict what the right answer might be when you're dealing with any critical reasoning question. Usually I just recommend that you clearly read the argument and clearly read the question and give yourself time to really understand everything that's presented, and then take a little bit of time considering each of the answer choices. But when it comes to an assumption question, I really recommend that you kind of think about a few potential weaknesses in the argument. Number four, look through the answer choices and find one that is connected to the weakness, or to a weakness in the argument. All right. And once again, I mean, I know that this is very abstract, just talking about this in the abstract like this. So we're going to clarify all of this in a little bit. And number five, of course, as always, justify your answer. And you can see far more about justifications later on. So this is how this is in general terms how I recommend that you approach an assumption question. Okay, now let's get a little bit more specific about what I mean when I say an assumption, and specifically, what do I mean with this useful definition? I called it a useful definition, that an assumption is the opposite / negative of a weakness. What on earth do I mean by that? Okay, so we're going to go down. And we're going to take a moment to consider this argument. So I'll first read it to you. So average incomes in city X are rising. Therefore, the restaurant industry in city X is likely to grow in the near future. Okay, and I recommend that you pause the video at this point and really reread this argument, read it several times, 3, 4 times, and really think. It might not be obvious how many weaknesses are present in this argument already, but really think about some of the weaknesses that are inside this argument, some of the potential things that could weaken this argument. I'll give you a moment to do that. Okay, so welcome back. Hopefully you took a few minutes to think about this one. Alright, so let's look at it together. Oops, I didn't mean to go down. Sorry about that. Okay, so it says average incomes in city X are rising. Therefore, the restaurant industry in city X is likely to grow in the near future. So first of all, we definitely want to identify the evidence and the conclusion in this case. So the evidence is that average incomes are rising, right? Oops, I didn't mean to do that. And the conclusion is that the restaurant industry is likely to grow. Okay, well, I guess what the author is kind of saying is that, well, people have more money now. They're making more money. The incomes are going up. So they're probably going to be spending some of this money in the restaurant industry, right? Okay, now it's time to think about some weaknesses. Let's think about a few weaknesses. Now, I usually like to start weaknesses by saying, what if, right? What if? So let's think. So what if, for example, what if maybe people in this city, in city X, what if they like to travel, right? And what if they're going to spend, what if they're going to spend their money traveling instead of going to restaurants? What if the people in city X will spend their extra money traveling instead of going to restaurants? Okay, now it's an interesting weakness right there. Let's see if we can find another one. So the average incomes are rising, so the restaurant industry is going to grow, okay, or is likely to grow in the near future. Well, let's think about this. So average incomes are going up. Average incomes are going up. Okay, well, what if prices are going up as well, right? So what if, for example, the prices in the restaurants are rising, are going up even more quickly than the average incomes, right? That would be interesting. So if that were to happen, then even though people are making more money at the end of the month, right, they don't actually have more money to spend in these restaurants. So what if, so let's say, what if restaurant prices are rising faster than average incomes? Whoops. Right? What if restaurant prices are rising faster than average incomes? Okay, we've got two good weaknesses that we've already found within this argument. And they're very specific, right? In the first one, we talked about travel. In the second one, we talked about restaurant prices. Each of these, seems pretty clear that it would weaken the argument if either of these were true. That would be a big problem for the restaurant industry in the future, right? Let's use these weaknesses to find some more general weaknesses. Right? These are very specific weaknesses. In fact, I'm just going to write that up here. These are very specific weaknesses. let's use these to find general weaknesses. So this first specific weakness that I found was, what if the people in city X are going to spend their extra money traveling instead of going to restaurants? Well, I mean, it would work. It would also work if I said, what if they will spend their extra money going to museums? Or what if they will spend their extra money going camping? Or what if they spend their extra money doing really anything else aside from going to restaurants? So this is why I'm just kind of figuring out how big I can make this weakness. So the specific weakness I found was about travel, but it really could be, what if they spend their extra money doing anything else other than restaurants? So I'm going to write that. So what if the people of city X will spend their money doing other things rather than going to restaurants? Right? There you go. What if the people of city X will spend their money doing other things? Right? That's a general weakness, and I found it not by just directly finding that weakness. General weaknesses are kind of harder to find than specific ones. I found it by first finding a specific weakness about travel and then expanding it and thinking about the sort of general figures, kind of thinking, how big can I make it? Let's do the same thing with the second weakness right there. So the second specific weakness was, what if restaurant prices are rising faster than average incomes? Okay, well, that would certainly hurt the restaurant industry, because then people wouldn't actually have more money to spend at the end of the month. Even though they're making more money, their incomes are higher. But is it only restaurant prices that would affect the restaurant industry in that case? What about taxes, right? Maybe people are making, the incomes are higher, but the taxes are higher as well, so people don't really have that much more money to spend at the end of the month. Or what about rental prices or property values, right? What about prices in general, just prices at the grocery store? Maybe people are now spending more money on the items that they have to buy for their apartments. So there are all sorts of other things that could also affect the amount of money that people will have at the end of the month to spend on restaurants. So all of these can kind of be summed up in the cost of living. So that's what I'm going to write. So what if the cost of living in city X is rising faster than incomes? Right? Okay, so that's pretty general. So the cost of living, really, it could be it doesn't need to just be the restaurant prices. It could be any of the factors, anything in city X, rents or taxes, or anything that affects how much money you have to spend on restaurants, right, at the end, or how much how much free money you have to spend on things that you want to do at the end of the month. Okay, so we found a couple good ones. Now let's go back through, and with each of these we're going to find an assumption. So we're going to go to our first specific weakness. What if the people in city X will spend their extra money traveling instead of going to restaurants? Well, once you have a weakness, it's pretty easy to find an assumption. You just turn it around, right? I'll show you what I mean. So an assumption, the way I would state an assumption is, I say, the people in city X will not spend their extra money traveling instead of going to restaurants. The people in city X will not spend their extra money traveling instead of going to restaurants, right? I've just taken that weakness and I have gotten rid of it. Okay, well, let's do the same thing with the next one. So what if restaurant prices are rising faster than average incomes? Well, that's a weakness. Whoops. Oh my goodness, I can't write. Assumption. So the assumption based on this weakness would be simply restaurant prices, I'll be a little bit more specific, in city X are not rising faster than personal incomes. Right? Now these are both good assumptions. These are certainly valid assumptions. These are, if you were writing an essay, it would be okay to say that these are assumptions. These are definitely assumptions in the argument. But usually when we use the word assumption, we mean something a bit bigger than just like one specific detail, right? We want to focus on the big picture, not just on a small little detail. And that's why it's good to then just go to the general weaknesses, right? And think about the assumptions that we can draw from then. So, our first general weakness was, what if the people of city X will spend their money doing other things rather than going to restaurants? Well, a general assumption based on this, we can call it a general assumption, why not, is that the people of city X will spend at least some of their money, right, going to restaurants. At least some of their money, I should say of their extra money, the new money that they've earned because their incomes have gone up, going to restaurants. Excellent. Let's do the same thing with the next one. So our weakness, our general weakness, is what if the cost of living in city X is rising faster than incomes? Okay, well that means that our general assumption is simply the cost of living in city X is not rising faster than incomes. Right? And there we go. That's everything there is to it. So hopefully in this example you've noticed something very kind of, you've noticed something by doing it the way that we've done it. And I'm going to say the best definition of an assumption, the best definition of an assumption is the following. An assumption is a statement that gets rid of a potential weakness in an argument. Right? That's all it is. It's a statement that kind of, you kind of look at the argument, you think of a few weaknesses, and if you just turn the weaknesses around or you get rid of the weakness, you have an assumption, right? So in this argument, right, just to give us one final example, right, or to come back to the examples that we have, our argument was really quite simple. Average incomes in city X are rising, therefore the restaurant industry in city X is likely to grow in the near future, right? It probably wouldn't have been obvious that then suddenly we would find an assumption about the cost of living in city X, that the cost of living in city X is not rising faster than incomes, right? But by working through the weakness, we could finally get to that assumption. Okay, there's a lot to unpack here, so don't worry, we're going to be doing a few more examples of this same thing. Okay, so I have another argument for you, and I would like you to take a moment to read it and to think of a few weaknesses. And if you, pause the video, and if you feel particularly brave, to try to write down a few assumptions based on those weaknesses. Okay, so welcome back. I hope you've had a chance to kind of think about this one a little bit. Let's first take apart the argument, so I'll reread it. The argument is, manatees swim in rivers that often have heavy boat traffic. Therefore, the propellers of boats are a serious threat to manatee populations. Alright, so let's think about this. So first of all, let's just separate out the evidence and the conclusion. Oops, sorry about that. Conclusion. So here the evidence is, well, manatees swim in rivers with boat traffic. Manatees swim in rivers that also have boats in them, okay. And our conclusion is then that boats, propellers, are a threat, a serious threat to manatees. Right? Okay, that's a good way of summarizing it right there. Alright, so let's think first about some weaknesses. And remember, I like to always begin a weakness by saying, what if? What if this is true? So let's see. So manatees swim in rivers that have heavy boat traffic. Therefore, the propellers of these boats are probably a serious threat to manatee populations. Well, you may not know what manatees are. You may know what manatees are, but it doesn't really matter. Right? It doesn't really matter. We can still confront this argument. So manatees they're an aquatic mammal. You might have thought that they were fish if you'd never seen the word before. That's understandable, certainly. But let's think about this. So what if manatees only swim at hours when boats are also when boats are not present on the rivers, right? What if the manatees and the boats swim at different times, right? Well, that's certainly an interesting weakness. What would be the assumption based on that? Well, the assumption then would be that manatees and manatees swim. Sorry, I have to, because boats don't swim. I almost said manatees and boats swim, but that doesn't really make much sense. So I'm gonna say manatees swim at least sometimes when boats are present on the rivers, right? So for if they swum at completely different times, if the manatees swum at times when the boats were not on the rivers, then clearly the propellers of the boats could not affect the manatees in a serious way. But if we now know that manatees swim sometimes, just even at least sometimes, and I'm always very careful to not overstate things, to not say like they always swim when the boats are present. If they swim at least sometimes when the boats are present on the rivers, then that means that yes, it seems like the propellers of the boats are a serious threat to the manatee populations. Okay, well, let's think of another one. So what if manatees swim, what if they swim at like the bottom of the river? And the boats are always, they're just floating on top of the river water. So what if manatees swim at depths that make them, let's see how I'm going to phrase this. What if manatees swim at depths that, at such depths, I'm going to say it this way, at such depths that boats' propellers, oh goodness gracious, how do you, that they don't come into contact, don't come into contact with boats' propellers. Right? That would certainly be a problem for this argument. What if, I mean, you may know that manatees generally swim at the, just on the surface of the water. But we don't know that from this argument. What if sometimes, or very often, manatees are swimming very, very deep in the water, and so they just are swimming below the boats, and they don't come into contact with the boat's propellers. Okay. So the assumption here that we could bring from this is that manatees swim. And once again, we could be very, very precise and not risk anything. We could say at least sometimes at depths near to boats' propellers. Right? Or at depths in which they could come into contact with boats' propellers. Okay, so we've found, just by looking at this very short, very compact arguments, where you might not have thought that there was very much there, we found two very good assumptions, right? So assumption number one, manatees swim at least sometimes when the boats are present on the rivers, right? And the assumption number two is that manatees swim at least sometimes at depths near to boats' propellers, right? They don't swim so deep that they never come close to the propellers of the boats. You could probably find a few more assumptions from this text. I certainly invite you to try to do so. But in any case, I hope you kind of are beginning to see the picture here. We're really using the weaknesses first, and then we're getting rid of the weaknesses, each of the weakness, by the statement of the assumption, right? The assumption is a statement that's just kind of getting rid of that weakness that we found. Okay, don't worry, there's more to come. Let's go down to the next one. All right, so I'd like you to read through this, pause the video, really take a moment to kind of think about it, to try to find a few weaknesses. And this time, I definitely want you to turn those weaknesses, or turn that weakness that you found, into an assumption. Okay, so welcome back. Let's read this argument together. So it says, according to a recent study, people who exhibit high levels of stress are also more likely to be heavy smokers than those who exhibit lower levels of stress. Okay. Therefore, it is clear that a high level of stress is a common cause of smoking. Okay, well, let's see. So once again, evidence and conclusion. Here the evidence is the study. I guess I'd say the study linking heavy smoking and stress. And the conclusion is that stress is a common cause of smoking. Okay. Alright, now hopefully you came to a couple weaknesses in this argument. One thing that you might notice, if you're really a detail-oriented person like myself, is that in the evidence we really talk about heavy smoking or heavy smokers, and then in the conclusion we only talk about smoking in general, right? Heavy smoking, and then smoking in general. Well, maybe that's going to be useful to us, maybe not, but it's a good thing to notice in any case. Okay, so let's come up with a few weaknesses. So weaknesses. Well, let's think about this. So we have this study that says that there's, they're heavy smoking and stress, and they're linked. And then finally, the study says, well, stress is clearly a common cause of smoking. This is what we call, I'll write this here, a causal argument. A causal argument. And a causal argument usually goes in the following way. X and Y are linked in some way. Linked in some way. Another word for that is correlated. Therefore, X causes Y. Right? That's how a causal argument usually goes. There's some connection between the two, and then we suddenly make the conclusion that, draw the conclusion that X is causing Y. Okay, so this is a causal argument, but that doesn't really change necessarily how we're going to look at it. All right, well, the first thing that I might want to know, all that we know is that X and Y are linked, or in this case, that there's some link between heavy smoking and high levels of stress. Okay, so what if it's the other way around, right? I mean, I'm not sure. Maybe smoking. What if smoking itself, right? Smoking itself causes high levels of stress, right? That's possible, right? There are all sorts of things that relax you in smoking, but there are also things that might cause your stress receptors to start working overtime, right? We certainly don't know within this argument whether that is a possibility. So what if smoking itself causes high levels of stress? Okay, well, if that were true, then whoever made this argument got it all wrong. It's not the stress that's causing the smoking, it's the smoking that's causing the stress. And so the assumption that we could draw is simply smoking does not or is not the cause of the stress. Is not the cause of the high levels of stress exhibited by the participants in the study. You see, it's my best Gmat sentence ever. Smoking is not the cause of the high levels of stress exhibited by the participants in the study. I really feel like a 1950s scientist when I write sentences like that. Okay, but in any case, we've found a good assumption based on that weakness. Let's see if we can find maybe another weakness in this argument, a potential weakness. Right? Let's see. So maybe there's a problem with the study itself. Whenever we see something that's based on a study, we always want to know a little bit more, right? So what type of problem could there be in this study? What if the study participants were, let's see, what could we say? Maybe a problem with the study, or what if something else, actually maybe not a problem with the study, I'm beginning to see a little bit more clearly. What if something else entirely is causing both the stress and the smoking, right? What if, I don't know, what if it also happens to be that most of the people that in this study who both had high levels of stress and were heavy smokers, what if those people were also unemployed, right? Right? What if some other factor, let's see, what if some other factor, such as unemployment, caused both the high levels of stress and the heavy smoking among the study participants. Right? That's possible, right? If you think about that, well, maybe, there's some other factor that we didn't actually test for in the study, right? There's some other link between these people, something like unemployment, but it doesn't have to be unemployment. Maybe it's a family situation, or maybe it's, maybe they're just recently, or maybe these people are students, and students have tons and tons of stress. Maybe these people are all trying to pass the Gmat exam. I don't know. They're all people studying for the Gmat, and so that's causing both the stress and the smoking just after their gargantuan study sessions. I don't know. That's a possibility. So what if some other factor, such as unemployment, is actually the thing that's causing the levels of stress and the heavy smoking? If that were the case, then it's not the stress that's causing the smoking. It's the unemployment that happens to be causing both of them at the same time. Okay, so then our assumption would be simply a separate factor did not cause both the smoking and the stress for the participants of the study. Right? I probably could have phrased that a little bit better, but I think you get the picture. That there isn't another factor that's causing both of these, and that gets rid of this weakness, which is what if it's because they're all unemployed, or what if it's because they're all studying for the GMAT exam and banging their heads against a wall. Okay, hopefully this is, what was really weird at the beginning when I said assumptions are the opposite of a weakness, or assumptions are the opposite of weaknesses, or whatever I said at the beginning. Hopefully this is becoming a little bit clearer as we go through these questions. But never fear, there are always more questions where those came from. Okay, so let's do this one now. So once again, I'll give you a moment to read it. Take your time, don't rush through it. Really think of a few weaknesses, and from those weaknesses try to derive at least one assumption. So you'll pause the video and take a moment to do that. Okay, let's see. So, I'll read it first. So the new computers that our company's directors purchased are only 75% faster than the old ones at processing new orders. Therefore, if our sales force's productivity remains the same as before, we should only see a 75% improvement in productivity and not a doubling of productivity, as our directors have claimed. Alright, so there's maybe a lot to unpack, but let's just quickly see the evidence. The evidence is that the new computers are 75% faster than the old ones, the conclusion is then that we'll only see a 75% increase in productivity. And then the author kind of makes a jab at his directors and says, not a doubling of productivity. That's not going to be possible, right? Not a doubling of productivity. So we could really kind of consider either of these the conclusion. Maybe the real conclusion is we're only going to see a 75% improvement in productivity. Maybe what the author really wants to say is we're not going to double productivity, like our directors think that we will. Either of those, both of those are kind of similar, and they both certainly work as the conclusion. All right, so our next step: weaknesses. What if? Okay, so weakness number one. Let's think about this for a second. What if? So it says the new computers are only 75% faster at processing new orders. Okay. Well, let's see. It also it does kind of say that the sales force's productivity, it says if the sales force's productivity remains the same as before. So, if it didn't say that, I would definitely say, well, what if, they start selling more orders or something like that? But it kind of implies that that's not, that the author's already considered that and is talking about the hypothetical situation where that does not happen. Okay, so let's pause there for a moment. Let's think. So But there are other things that could improve the productivity of the computers. What if the new computers have more storage, right? Maybe it's not just processing new orders that is important for the productivity. So what if storage is also important for the productivity, right? What if the so this is kind of two things. So what if the new computers have more storage capacity than the old ones? And storage capacity is important for productivity, right? That's possible. Okay, well then the assumption is, either one or the other. It's either that the new computers do not have greater storage capacity than the older ones. But we could also say that that an assumption that we've just found is that storage itself, or other things other than processing orders, quickly, do not impact productivity. All right, and so we come to kind of like, I guess, one of the main assumptions here, which is just that the author basically says that the only thing that's going to impact productivity is how quickly the new orders are processed, right? That the processing of the orders is the only thing that can impact productivity. But maybe greater storage capacity could also increase. I mean, the new orders are 75% more, and the little bits of storage capacity could bring that to 100% more productivity. Who knows, right? Okay, so I think that's good for this one. Let's move on to the next one. This is the final assumption question before we go into inferences right afterward. Okay, so take a moment to look at this, take a moment to find some weaknesses on your own, and find the assumptions from those. Okay, well, let's take a look at this together. So it says the government of country X has recently announced the discovery of large deposits of fossil fuels within its borders. This is certainly good news for the country's economy. Exports of these fossil fuels will eventually bring greater wealth to the country. All right, so this seems like a, type of argument just torn from the headlines. Let's tear it apart a little bit. Why is that bigger than? I feel like that's bigger than, I don't know, whatever, doesn't matter. So the evidence and the conclusion. So the evidence is new discovery of fossil fuel deposits. Okay, and the conclusion is exports of fossil fuels will bring wealth to the country. Great. Okay, so now we need to find a few weaknesses, as usual. So let's think of a few weaknesses. So what if, well, I mean, let's see. So the discovery of large deposits of fossil fuels within its borders. Well, what if these deposits are, in mountainous or areas that are difficult to access, or they're under the sea or something, and the technology just doesn't exist to, even though we know that they're there, what if the technology doesn't exist to access? The technology doesn't exist to access these deposits. And I could even say, what if the technology does not yet exist to access these deposits and is unlikely to exist in the near future, right? Okay, well, I mean, the technology doesn't exist and it's unlikely to exist in the near future. Well, that could be a big problem. So an assumption within this argument would be that the technology to access these deposits, or to not just to access, I should say, to extract these deposits, these fossil fuels from these deposits, either exists or will eventually exist, right? That's something we just kind of turned around that weakness. We got rid of that weakness. So, the only way for this to make sense is if the technology is either there or it will eventually be there. But of course, if the fossil fuels are in such difficult to access places that the technology is just unlikely to ever be made, well, then we have a big problem in this argument. Let's see if we can find another, though. So it says exports of these fossil fuels. Exports of these fossil fuels will bring wealth to the country. Well, what if, thought about this, what if people start using more of the fossil fuels within the country, right? So what if people within country X start using more and more fossil fuels, right? Maybe they are beginning to, because they have all of these fossil fuels within their borders, they're building bigger houses, and they're driving their cars, and they're owning more cars, and maybe they're big construction projects, and they're building huge transit systems, and they're developing their cities. Maybe they suddenly, because they have the fuels available, they decide they're not going to export them, they're going to use them domestically. Okay, well, the assumption then would be people in country X will not, and we need to be careful here, it's not that they're not ever going to use greater amounts of fossil fuels than they already do, but they will not use all of the fossil fuels discovered in deposits domestically. They will not use them domestically, right? Or they will not use all of them domestically. There are still going to be some fossil fuels left over after everything that's been used, even if their consumption goes up, even if their consumption increases, even if they do build those houses and drive those cars, there will still be some fossil fuels left over for them to export. Because if there weren't, then, well, exports would not even be possible. There's no more fuels to export. Okay, so that was our discussion of assumptions, and I hope that it was really enlightening, because I just, from the hundreds of students I've worked with, I know that assumptions can be intimidating. Assumption questions can be intimidating because it's really just not a natural thing, in the same way that maybe weaken questions are a bit more natural. In our everyday lives, we do things like find weaknesses in arguments. I mean, that's one of the things that we're best at as human beings. In our everyday lives, we don't really spend much time thinking about the assumptions hidden within arguments. But assumption questions do not have to be intimidating, right? If you can do weakened questions, if you can find weaknesses, you can find assumptions. You just have to be careful, and you have to be methodical about it. It's really nothing more complicated than that. Okay, so I think it's time, though, that we talk about, here, let me just do this quickly, give myself another page here. It is absolutely time that we talk about inferences. Now, I have great news for everybody. Inferences, in many ways, are just fundamentally easier than assumptions. Inference questions are easier than assumption questions. That's because you don't have to think about arguments. Inferences are not about argumentation. They're not about reading between the lines. They're not about getting creative and finding weaknesses. Inference questions are simply about what is in the text and what is not in the text. An inference question could basically be phrased as, what did you just read, right? And so that's what I like to go with. So what did you just read? Right? That's what an inference question is trying to find out. So when we're dealing with an inference, we're in a different territory. It's more about, like, did you understand what you just read? Are you the type of person that can read something and not and doesn't kind of invent things based on what they read, but just can just sort of look at what was there and separate the things that are definitely in the text from the things that are not in the text? And so an inference, the definition of an inference, quite simply, is a statement that is 100% true. True based on the text. That's it, right? That's it. An inference is just any statement that is definitely true based on the text. When dealing with inference questions, right, a helpful strategy for inference questions is process of elimination. Process of elimination. Sometimes, right? Sometimes, and we'll see this in a moment, sometimes it's easier to eliminate things that are definitely wrong than to find or directly find, or to find than directly to find. I don't like to split infinitives here. Directly to find the right answer. Okay, we'll see this in a second. It should all become more clear as we go along. Right? Okay. So once again, let's just give ourselves a few guidelines how to approach an inference question. Number one, as usual, and this is no different from any other critical reasoning question, read the text carefully and slowly. You might even want to read it twice. I mean, I almost always read these texts twice. Number two, carefully consider what the question is asking you about. Be very careful about what the question is saying. The clues are often hidden in the way in which the question is formulated. And just because it's an inference question doesn't mean that you just immediately read the question and move on. No, still focus on how the question is being phrased. Number three, once we've read the text slowly and we've carefully considered what the question is asking, eliminate the wrong answer choices. And number four, justify the correct answer. Right? This is where we kind of look at the correct answer, the one that we're going to choose, and we say, oh yeah, that does make sense for this and this and this reason. Right? We justify the correct answer. Okay, so to do this, we're just going to actually dive directly into some questions. So with no further ado, and I know this time we're going to go through full questions with answer choices. So I'll give you a little bit of time. Please take the time to really go through this methodically, and we're going to look at it together in just a moment. So please pause the video, take the time that you need. Welcome back. So hopefully that wasn't too much text. We're already more than an hour into this. You're probably getting a bit exhausted about hearing me talk on about this stuff, but nonetheless, here we are. So let's look. So first I'm going to read the text. So the text says, since 1989, the importation of ivory from African elephants to the United States and Canada has been illegal. But the importation of ivory from ancient mammoths has remained legal. Okay. A reliable method for differentiating ivory obtained from African elephants and that obtained from ancient mammoths was found only in 1997. Okay. In the year after the institution of this new method of differentiating the two different types of ivory, no significant change in the amount of ivory imported into the United States or Canada occurred. Alright, so there's a lot of information there, but let's just quickly go through it, in summary form. So in the first sentence we learn that ivory from African elephants, or importation of ivory from African elephants into the US and into Canada has been illegal ever since 1989. But that you still can, you still can import ivory from ancient mammoths. Okay, so that has remained legal. However, there was no reliable or fully reliable way of differentiating, of distinguishing which type of ivory you were importing, whether it was African elephant ivory or ancient mammoth ivory. The only reliable method was found, or the first reliable method was found only in 1997. So between 1989 and 1997, there was no reliable method for differentiating the two. Okay. Let's see. In the year after the institution, so after this method was discovered, the numbers or the rates of import didn't really change, or the amount of import didn't really change. Okay, so the question: if the above statements are true, which of the following must be true? So this is must be true. It's the same thing as which of these is an inference. Which of these is an inference based on this text? And so we return to our 100% rule. We're just looking for one of these answer choices that is 100% true based on the text that we just read. And if there's even one little thing in the choice that's not entirely true, we get rid of it. We don't look at it again. Okay, so let's go down the list. So number 1. The ban on the importation of ivory from African elephants to the United States and Canada was instituted as a result of significant declines in the numbers of African elephants. Okay, well, that's possible. That's possible, but we don't know why. We certainly don't know why they decided to ban the importation. It probably for, endangered species reasons, maybe, to protect the numbers of African elephants. That seems really plausible. That's possible. But in this text, we can't say that that is 100% true. So we eliminate it, right? So this one is out. I'm going to make it in bold so that we know it's out. It's gone. We don't look at it again. Number 2, between 1989 and 1997, customs agents were unable to distinguish African elephant ivory from ancient mammoth ivory with full accuracy. Okay. Well, that actually seems true. Between 1989 and 1997, I mean, there was no this reliable method hadn't been found yet, right? So it's true that they couldn't distinguish the ivory with full accuracy during that period of time. It's a little weird that it says between 1989 and 1997 because, after all, I guess before 1989 it would have been the same thing. But this does actually seem to be true. So this is potentially convincing. Let's look at number 3. Number 3, because the amount of ivory imported into the United States and Canada changed very little in the year following 1997, it is unlikely that significant importations of illegal ivory had taken place before 1997. All right, so there's a couple things wrong with this. First of all, this statement, number 3, looks very much like an opinion. An opinion is not going to be the answer to an inference question. An inference question is something that is definitely 100% true. So it's a fact based on a set of statements. An opinion is something that is, maybe true, but is not going to satisfy our conditions. So we don't know whether it's unlikely or not, right? This is simply an opinion, so let's get rid of it. So number 3 is eliminated. Number 4, before 1997, officials had no way to distinguish ivory from African elephants and that from ancient mammoths. Okay, well, we know that it is true that in 1997, that's the first time that this reliable method was found, right? However, there is something that I don't like in this. I don't like this statement right here, that they had no way to distinguish, because maybe they had a few methods. They weren't fully reliable, right? But they helped, right? They were kind of accurate. We don't know if they had absolutely no way of differentiating the two types of ivory before 1997. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of number 4 as well. That's eliminated. And now I'll go down to 5. So before 1989, the importation of ivory was not illegal in either the United States or Canada. Okay. Well, that does seem to be true, right? It says since 1989, the importation of ivory from African elephants has been illegal, right? But there is something that I don't like about this. There is something that I really don't like about this. It just says ivory, right? It doesn't say ivory from African elephants. We don't know about other types of ivory. Maybe, there's ivory from other animals even, right? It's not just elephants that have ivory. So we don't know about other types of ivory. Maybe there were types of ivory that were legal before 1989. So we can eliminate this one, and wonderful, we've got our answer. It's number 2. Okay, well, hopefully that made sense to you. Really, the way I went through it was quite straightforward. I simply, I spent a good amount of time reading the text and really clearly understanding it so that I was prepared to look at the answer choices. And remember that when you're going through these questions, if you find yourself constantly having to look back at the text with each answer choice or with many answer choices, that's an indication that the first time around you're not really reading the text sufficiently. If you're doing a sufficient job at reading the text, you should probably not have to look up at the text very often. Maybe a little bit, but not very often. That should not be necessary. Okay, let's go on to the next one. So once again, you've stuck with me long enough. I would like you to take a moment to read this question yourself, carefully consider everything, and try to find an answer. Okay, so welcome back. Welcome back. Let's take a look at this together. So the question reads, a company's two divisions performed with remarkable consistency over the past 3 years. In each of those years, the Pharmaceuticals division has accounted for roughly 20% of dollar sales and 40% of profits, and the Chemicals division for the balance. Okay. All right, so sometimes you have to do a little bit of math. Not much math, but a little bit of math, even though you think that you're on like a verbal question. But let's see. So we have two divisions. We have the Pharmaceuticals. I don't know why the text is so big, but whatever. And we have the Chemicals division. And let's see. So Pharmaceuticals, it says, has accounted for 20% of dollars sales and 40% of profits. Okay, fair enough. Then it says that the Chemicals division has accounted for the balance. So the balance is going to be the other 80% of dollar sales and the other 60% of profits. Whoops, profits, not profist, profits. Okay, well that's cool. And then they were consistent over the past 3 years. Fine. Okay, the question says, which of the following can properly be inferred regarding the past 3 years from the statement above? Okay, so we know that everything that we've written down here is true for the past 3 years. That it's been consistent for the past 3 years. Okay, and once again, this is an inference, saying which of the following can be inferred. Right, that's an inference question, and all that means is which of these is definitely 100% true based on this text that we've just read. Okay, so let's look through. So A, the first answer choice, it says total dollar sales for each of the company's divisions have remained roughly constant. Okay. All right. Well, that seems, it says that they perform consistently with remarkable consistency. True, but there's something I don't like. There's always something I don't like. Total dollar sales, right? Well, remember, total dollar sales, this is a number. Actually, I should say a fixed number. Like total dollar sales, that's going to be something like 100,000 or 300,000 or maybe $30. I don't know. Depends on how big the company is. But it's going to be a fixed number. But the only thing that we talk about in the text are percentages, right? We talk about 20% of dollar sales, 40% of profits. It says that they perform consistently in terms of percents. That doesn't mean that the total dollar sales have been the same. So always be careful. Whenever you're given percents, that doesn't mean anything about the total amount, the total number. Okay, so this one we can get rid of. Let's look at the next one, B. The Pharmaceuticals division has faced stiffer competition in its markets than has the Chemicals division. Oh, I don't like this one at all. Stiffer competition. Okay, stiffer competition. Well, we don't know anything about the competition. We don't know. Maybe that's why the profit. Maybe that's why it's the dollar sales are lower and the profits are low. But we don't know anything about the competition, so we certainly can't say why the profits are lower than the Chemicals division, or the percentage of profits are lower. Okay, so C, the Chemicals division has realized lower profits per dollar of sales than has the Pharmaceuticals division. Okay, well, it looks like we might have to do a little bit of math on this one. Let's come back to it. So I'm going to leave C for right now, because I don't want to do that math unless I really have to. I don't want to. I don't like thinking. I don't like thinking until I have to think. D, the product mix offered by each of the company's divisions has remained unchanged. Well, we don't know. I mean, the product mix, I guess that means the types of products that they're using and the breakdown, the division of those products. Well, I don't know anything about those products based on this text. That's out. And then E, highly profitable products accounted for a higher percentage of the chemicals division sales than of those of the pharmaceuticals division. Okay, well, once again, I mean, maybe that's true. Maybe that's why the profits were bigger in the, the percentage of profits was bigger for the chemicals division than for the pharmaceuticals division. But we don't know anything about the profitability of the products. We don't know anything about that at all. And so we've eliminated everything, which leaves us with C. And let's just check ourselves really quickly. So let's reread C. It says the chemicals division has realized lower profits per dollar of sales than has the pharmaceuticals division. Okay, well let's figure this out. Oops, I didn't mean to go down there. Let's figure this out. So let's see. So profits per dollar. So profits per dollar, that would be 40 per 20, right? Profits per dollar, right? That would be for the pharmaceutical division. Let's figure this out for the chemical division. The chemicals division, it would be the profits, it would be 60 per 80 profits per dollar. Okay, yeah, so actually, so this, this is equal to 2. The profits per dollar is 2, and here it's equal to 3/4, right? 3 or 0.75, right? And so it's definitely true that for the pharmaceuticals division it's higher than for the chemicals division. So the chemicals division is lower than the pharmaceuticals division. Oof, that was tiring to say. So yeah, the answer is C, right? Okay, we're getting there. I'd like you to take a moment now to consider this problem right here. Okay, so welcome back. We're getting to the end, but we're not there yet. So let's take a look at this problem together. So it says, on average, managers with more than 200 employees in their charge exhibit high levels of intuitive thinking in their decision-making processes. Okay. This is in contrast to managers with between 50 and 200 employees. Such managers typically exhibit higher levels of methodical and formulaic rather than intuitive decision-making. All right. Surprisingly, the average manager between 10 and 50 employees exhibits even higher levels of intuitive thinking and decision-making than do even managers of more than 200 employees. All right, there's okay, so this is just sort of a set of statements. Let's see. So basically we're saying that managers with a lot of employees, more than 200 employees, are really intuitive in how they think. Then it says that managers with between 50 and 200 employees are not very intuitive, or they're more methodical and formulaic. And then managers with a small number of employees, 10 to 50 employees, are also very highly intuitive in their thinking, or even more so than the managers with lots and lots of employees. Okay, so I think we've got that. So it says, which of the following conclusions can logically be drawn from the statements above? Okay, so this is just really another way of asking an inference question. What can we say? What can we draw from the statements above? And it's important to note, when it's true that when we talk about conclusions in other questions, we usually mean, an opinion, right? Some sort of opinion. It may not always be true. It's not necessarily true, but it's an opinion based on a bit of evidence. But when we're being asked to find a conclusion in a question like this one, so when we're being asked to find the conclusion, or to draw a conclusion rather, well, it's completely different. If we are asked to draw a conclusion, we need to find something that is definitely true, not just our opinion, but something that's definitely true based on the text. So when we are asked to find a conclusion, not just our opinion, right, about what's going on in the text. Okay, that should be fine. So let's take a look. So number one, intuitive decision making leads to better business success than does either formulaic or methodical decision making. Okay, well, I don't know about you, but I certainly don't like this. Better business success. Who said anything about these managers being successful, right? We don't know any. I mean, maybe they're successful, maybe they're not. We don't know from this text. Number two, managers with many employees and those with few employees face similar decision-making challenges. Okay, well, it's true that there is something similar about the managers with more than 200 and the ones with between 10 and 50 employees. But do we know that it's it's because they have the same challenges, the same decision-making challenges? We know that they're both they're both intuitive. They're both intuitive in their thinking, but we don't know if it's because they face the same challenges. Maybe they face very different challenges, but intuition is good for many different challenges. Excuse me. So we really can't say much about that. Number three, intuitive thinking is essential to most management decision making. Okay. Well, I mean, it's tempting because 2 out of the 3 types of managers we've talked about are intuitive in their thinking. But maybe most managers have between 50 and 200 employees. We don't know about most managers and most management decision making. Maybe there are more managers with a medium level of employees than either of the two combined, right? Than either a greater number of employees or a smaller number of employees combined. So this we cannot say. Number 4, managers of between 10 and 50 employees often receive direct promotions. Direct promotions to roles in which they manage over 200 employees. Hopefully nobody went for this one. Direct promotions. I didn't see anybody get promoted in the text. Did you? So yeah, so get rid of it. We don't know if they receive direct promotions. Maybe they get promoted to managing more than 50 employees, or maybe they just leave the business world altogether. We don't know. Maybe they do other things aside from managing. Okay, well, which kind of leaves us with number 5. And let's read it together. It is theoretically possible to evaluate the levels of intuitive, methodical, and formulaic thinking in a manager's decision-making processes. Okay. Well, this is tricky because certainly if I were to just kind of look at this text and just give you find some inference based on it without looking at the answer choices, I certainly wouldn't have found this one. This certainly wouldn't have been the obvious one. But if you think about it, well, this whole text is about how there's intuitive thinking in some managers' thinking processes and not in others, and some people exhibit more, some people exhibit less, some people exhibit more methodical and formulaic thinking. Well, in order for any of that to even be possible, there is something that absolutely has to be true. And it absolutely has to be true that we can even determine whether somebody is an intuitive thinker in the first place, right? So the only way for this whole text to be true is if it's possible to be intuitive, or to figure out how a manager thinks, right? I like to call something like this a background inference. Now, that's not necessarily an official term. But a background inference is something, a statement that must be true for the text to exist in the first place. Right? So, I mean, in this text, we're talking about intuitive thinking, and we're talking about methodical and formulaic thinking. Well, if it were impossible to figure out how somebody thought, whether they were intuitive or methodical or formulaic, then we couldn't even be saying anything that we're saying in the text. None of this would even be possible. Okay. We've got, I think, only one more. Yeah, only one more, and then we'll call it a day. But I'll give you a moment to go through this final inference question right now. All right, welcome back. So let's read through it together. So according to a recent survey of voters in Center City, 30% of those under 35 support Jones for mayor. 15% of those over 35 support Jones for mayor, and 20% of all voters support Jones for mayor. All right, so sometimes there's a bit of math here, but let's think about this. So here, we're actually gonna, let's write this out a little bit. Whoops, I didn't mean to go all the way down there. Let's try to write some of this information down so that we have it in one place. So let's see, let's start with under 35. Under 35, we have, for the percentage that support Jones is 30%. 30%. Over 35, we have 15%. And the percentage of everybody, whoops, did I spell that right? Yeah, I did. Looks kind of funny. Don't know why. The percentage of everybody is 20%. Okay. All right, well, let's think about this for a second. Well, I mean, so 30% of people over 30% of people under 35, 15% of people over 35. He's clearly, younger people tend to like him more, but we could probably say that if there's only two candidates in this election, he's probably not going to win, according to this poll at least, or this survey. But we can also say, let's take a look. We can also say that this is kind of this, when it says everybody, 20% of everybody supports Jones for mayor. This is kind of the weighted average, right? This is kind of the weighted average of the voters, right? And in this case, it's closest, right? And I'll actually write this. The weighted average, the overall average is closest to the percentage for those over 35, or is closer, I should write. The overall average is closer to the percentage for those over 35 than to the percentage for those under 35. All right, everybody notice that 20% is closer to 15% than it is to 30%, right? So that kind of means that the average, the overall average, is being pulled more toward those over 35 than to those under 35. So there must be kind of more people who are over 35 than are under 35. Okay, well, that's something to think about. Certainly, you can check out my math videos where we do talk about weighted average, and we could actually solve this equation. We could figure out exactly what the weighted average is, but we probably don't have to do that. So that means that there are more people here. So let's say more people here, fewer people here, right? Because the average is closer to the over 35s than it is to the under 35s, the overall average. Okay, so then it says, if the information presented by the survey is accurate, which of the following must be true? Okay, so let's see. So Jones's campaign focused mainly on younger voters. Well, I don't like this. We don't know what he focused on. Maybe he focused on like older voters, but was really bad at convincing them. I don't know. He focused mainly on younger voters. We don't know anything about how his campaign worked. B, most voters between the ages of 35 and 45 do not support Jones for mayor. Okay. Well, that's probably true. It's almost certainly true. But that looks like a trick question or a trick answer choice because, frankly, we can't say it with 100% certainty. We know that there are not many people over 35 who support Jones for mayor. But what if, hear me out, what if there's one person, he's 40 years old, there's nobody else in this age range. This one guy is 40 years old and he supports Jones, and then there's a ton of people that are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, almost nobody, none of whom support Jones. That's possible, right? That is possible. So we don't know this to be true entirely, even though it seems like it's probably true. So I'm going to eliminate that. C, the number of voters under 35 who support Patrick's, an opponent of Jones, is lower than for those over 35. Well, I don't know anything about this guy Patrick's. I mean, who knows? I don't even know how many people Jones is running against. Maybe it's not two parties. Maybe it's 3, 4. You know, who knows how that's going to work. D, the number of people surveyed aged 35 and over was half that of people under 35. So that would be, so let's think. So that would mean that the older people, there should be fewer older people and more younger people. But that's completely the opposite of what that weighted average seems to say. The weighted average is closer to the older people than to the younger people. So there must be more older people in that average than younger people. Okay, so let's get rid of that. And then finally, most of those surveyed were over age 35. Well, that's actually kind of what we said. We said there have to be more people over 35 than under 35 for that weighted average to be true. And so there we go. Okay, well, I know that there was a little bit in there that might have seemed unclear to you. So I just want to dive into this a little bit. I just want to dive into this explanation a little bit more closely for 1 second. So if you're kind of unclear as to why most of those surveyed were over age 35, let's think about this for a second. If an equal number of people surveyed, let's say, were under 35 and over 35, then the overall percentage for Jones should be exactly between 15% and 30%. It would be 22.5%, right? However, you know, it's been pushed a little bit closer to the over 35% than to the under 35%. To the over 35s. It's been pushed in that direction, so we know that there are more people over 35. Once again, this is a weighted average question. So mathematically speaking, we could actually solve this fully, but we're not going to do that because this is the verbal section, and we should never really have to do full math. We should be able to understand what a weighted average is for the verbal section, but not have to do a full mathematical analysis at all. So there you go. I hope that this discussion, which was an hour and a half, so we're a bit longer than I had perhaps intended. Anyway, I hope this discussion really helps you out in distinguishing assumptions and inferences for the future. So I want to go down, and I'm just going to summarize. We're just going to summarize really quickly some of the stuff that we said. So one thing that we saw, number one, an assumption is the opposite slash, one way of looking at that is it's the negative of a weakness. Okay, that was the first thing that we saw. Number two, another way of thinking about that is an assumption is a statement that gets rid of a weakness, right? And so number three, for assumption questions, first find the weaknesses, right? So that's kind of what we talked about for assumptions, and then we moved on. We did a bunch of examples, and then we moved on to inferences. Inferences, right, an inference is any statement that is 100% true based on the text, right? And just remember that to find an inference, or to actually, I should say, to answer an inference question. An inference question, use process of elimination, right? So to answer an assumption question, you first find the weaknesses. To answer an inference question, I highly recommend that you just use a very distinct process of elimination. All right, well, the most important part, thanks for watching. And of course, good luck on your test. Anyway, so this video is part of a full Gmat course which is available on my website. You can take it. It's very easy it works very, very well on any computer. You can take it. It's full of practice questions, full of video explanations that are as detailed and as precise as the one that you've just experienced. And so all of that you can find on my website, which is eurogmat.com. So check me out there, and thanks a lot for watching, and I hope to see you again in the near future. So take care.